Hunger is a most terrible and dehumanizing affliction, a protracted death that physically debilitates and mentally impairs those under its blight, and which should have been already eradicated by now. As of today, famines are events that seem to belong to a distant past for developed nations, but are still very much part of recent history or even everyday life in many developing countries. Most people will probably be aware of the starvation in modern decades that tormented mostly African countries like Ethiopia, Congo, Mozambique, and Sudan, resulting in millions of dead, or the currently potentially catastrophic situation in Yemen. Yet, people have suffered from food scarcity and malnutrition throughout mankind's history, in all countries, empires and civilizations, due to war, government mismanagement, natural disasters, or poverty. Jack London's The People of the Abyss, for example, draws a poignant illustration of the miserable conditions in which hunger-stricken citizens live and die on the East End of London in early 20th century. A decade before Jack London's shocking account, Knut Hamsun wrote his first novel, Hunger, set in a city that was then called Christiania and is now known as Oslo, Norway's capital, and which has been adapted into a memorable film by Danish director Henning Carlsen in 1966. The film was the first Scandinavian production co-funded by Denmark, Norway and Sweden, which resulted in having a Danish crew, Swedish lead actors, and Norwegian locations, secondary actors and extras, and is nowadays widely considered to be one of the finest book-to-film adaptations. Its conception, however, wasn't easy given that, despite Knut Hamsun's stature as a Nobel Prize of Literature laureate, and the novel's imposing prestige as one of the groundbreaking and defining examples of modern literature, the author's ideological stance and politically conservative opinions before and during World War II included criticism towards the British Empire and America, and more damningly a sympathy for the fascist regimes in Europe, and particularly Nazi Germany. Still, the project managed to convince and obtain funding from the three countries, something which heavily benefited the film viewers and history. It was shot mostly on location in the actual Oslo streets and corners, though some of the interiors were performed in studio settings. Henning Carlsen describes in an interview how him and his crew had some streets covered in dirt to hide the asphalt, as well as putting up old streetlights and having to raise up tarps so as to block the unusually sunny autumn weather, given the desire to capture an overcast and gloomy Christiania fitting with the novel's atmosphere. The lead actor, Per Carlsen, delivers a mesmerizing performance in Hunger, even though he wasn't even the main choice for the role, but was considered after the first option, Pierre Mirburg, opted instead to perform as lead in The Italian Strawhat, a theatre play conducted by none other than Ingmar Bergman, the famed Swedish film director and the then director of the Royal Dramatic Theatre in Stockholm. His opposing lead actress, Gunnel Lindblom, was curiously part of Bergman's familiar troupe of habitués, having acted already in many of Bergman's most remarkable films of the 50s and 60s, such as The Seventh Seal, Wild Strawberries, The Virgin Spring, or Winterlight. Add to that the presence of crew members who had experience and were associated with household names such as Jean Renoir, Karl Dreyer, or Roman Polanski, and one's left with all the ingredients for an outstanding piece of filmmaking. Hunger tells the story of a young writer named Pontus that wanders the street of Christiania looking for work, while constantly harassed by hunger that he cannot extinguish given his destitute status. His attempts to land a job are marred by a variety of reasons, grounded on his weak physique, accidental mistakes on his applications, or just bad luck. His naturally impatient nature, stubbornness, extremely proud and occasionally bizarre demeanor do not do him any favors, preventing him from accepting several possibilities and offers to quench his lacerating starvation. Throughout the film, his personality is fleshed out in wonderful fashion amidst differing episodes that disclose the inner workings of his mind with pristine clarity, his principles and contradictions becoming evident without resorting to narration, a huge feat for a film, especially given the novel's inner monologue-driven narrative with its subjective undertones and psychological circumspection. He rejects generosity once presented with it, or its contingency, but ends up practicing charity, even in a position that would benefit him immensely not to. He doesn't refrain from indulging in prosaic urban etiquette in quotidian situations, but struggles to keep composure in closer exchanges with acquaintances or strangers, while showcasing a penchant for taunting the bothersome and permanently suspicious policeman. He asks strangers to thank God for him, but he's a profoundly disillusioned believer, so his requests come off as ironic, and even God seems to answer his call for a sign with bitter sarcasm as he then finds a wretched earthworm squirming on the ground in front of him for much symbolic chagrin. He claims to be the most honest and truthful man to be found, but is nevertheless opportunistic and seen lying and deceiving people on a daily basis, though admittedly this stems from his unwillingness to engage with others or due to his desperate condition that constantly threatens to shatter his dignity. Though honorable, clearly talented and bright, his intellectual value is overlooked and considered useless by a society that prizes practicality the most and offers not much beyond menial tasks for people of his worth. Even when bumping into friends and former acquaintances, he is quick to resume the meeting and escape, while occasionally venting his frustration towards strangers that disturb his meditation or creative process. At the end of the day, it's fair to say that viewers who are fond of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, Kafka's Metamorphoses, Pessoa's Book of Disquiet, Sartre's Nausea, or Camus' The Stranger will probably find Hunger to resonate in a weighty manner and feel some affinity towards its narrative and protagonist, with the Dostoevsky portrait even finding itself featured in the newspaper's office. Pontus, the main character of the film, is therefore condemned to hardship by the circumstances and by his own will, and the hunger that results from this quandary is ubiquitous and utterly debilitating, making its presence known while awake or asleep, in dreams or hallucinations. One of the fantasies developed by his famished position is suspected to be the woman we come to know as Ila Yali, marvelously interpreted by Gunnar Lindblom, a representation of a spontaneous and capricious bourgeois woman that instead of being repelled by his looks, is attracted by Pontus's cheekiness and bravery. In a series of episodes of uncertain facticity that are never really established as definitively happening beyond Pontus's head, both characters meet and converge up until an invitation to join Ila Yali's apartment delves into a scene with an almost Bergmanian tinge. At the same time, the extreme hunger that forces Pontus to scrape crumbs from his empty cupboard or ask a bone for his fictitious dog at the butcher's slowly acquires the shape of what some would consider aspects of paranoia or schizophrenia. On a little side note, viewers familiar with the Norwegian painter Edvard Munch will probably find similarities between how the artist portrayed some of his people, with uncomfortable probing gazes, and how Pontus sees his fellow citizens of Christiania that regularly seem to look askance at himself, sometimes in feverish overexposed POV shots. Pontus's descent into desperation and madness becomes particularly stirring in two scenes. The first after the pawnbroker he regularly visited refuses to accept his coat buttons, and Pontus breaks down in a short but fiery and impassionate retort that denounces the inhumanity of the pawnbroker and God, while the second happens close to the end of the film, after Pontus had glimpsed some light at the end of his existential torture, with the acknowledgement of his talents and payment for his work by a newspaper editor, but having failed to capitalize on it by not being able to correct his text, added to the opprobrium of his eviction from a lodging he had just miraculously secured, leading to an anguished and frenzied bout of despair that is only interrupted by the approach of a police officer. These and other circumstances, as well as the fact that Pontus is featured in every single scene of the film, and even when the spectator does not see him, he is watching what he sees or thinks, help define Per Carlsen's performance as a powerful depiction of an ailing and eccentric, but definitely human character worthy of commiseration, struggling amidst adversity, and clearly validate his merited Best Actor award at the Cannes Film Festival in 1966. But Hunger also impresses in other areas besides its interpretations, such as its unadorned approach to cinematography that often chooses to frame its characters in long lenses so as to freeze them in the intended kind of space and time trap mentioned by director Henning Carlsen, with an unassuming black and white approach that fortifies the emotional desaturation of its setting. Meanwhile, the use of sounds and even its absence are employed with utter precision and efficacy, notorious examples being the silence that emanates from Pontus's apartment after his lookout for work and strolls, or the thundering clatter of the carriages and the footsteps of the street populace, crafting an expressive, vivid contrast. Finally, the soundtrack, composed by Krzysztof Komeda, a Polish jazz pianist that had established a successful partnership with Polish director Roman Polanski, is truly eerie and disquieting, inducing a strong sense of ominous disaffection that fits the film perfectly. Surprisingly, it wasn't composed on a synthesizer, an instrument by then in its early stages, and which became widespread only a few years later, but its striking harmonic bass lines and melodies were sourced from the notes performed by the string section of the Oslo Symphonic Orchestra and then mixed in studio, an effort whose outcome was clearly ahead of its time. Hunger is a magnificent, albeit bleak, depiction of a conscientious lost soul drowning among an unforgiving world and unconcerned crowd, reflecting a malaise that may have had differing sources from that specific fin siècle era, but is quite the same as the one experienced in contemporary world. The sense of having time incessantly slipping through one's fingers, the physical and moral degradation of urban society, the suffering and melancholy that afflicts introspective individuals, the brutalizing effects of a degrading predicament, the barbarous atomization of a society enslaved by money, are all displayed in Hunger with keenness whilst staying truthful to the original work, and therefore rightly earned a place in a group of world film classics as a Scandinavian masterpiece. Have a look at the other videos on this channel if you're interested in acquainting yourself with movies from all ages and countries, and feel free to like, comment, share and subscribe. Thank you for listening and see you next time.